If someone had told me 3 months ago that I would be watching a human female convince 3 starving Xerathi cubs to eat by sharing her own meal with them, I would have recommended immediate psychological evaluation. Yet here I was, Senior Biological Coordinator Kelvin Northridge, staring through reinforced observation windows at the most impossible scene of my 30-year career. The human's name was Luna Brightwater. Yes, I know how that sounds. Humans have this peculiar habit of naming their offspring after celestial bodies and natural phenomena, as if they're trying to claim ownership of the entire universe through nomenclature alone. But don't let the whimsical name fool you. This particular human had just accomplished something that our top xenobiologists had declared impossible. She had made contact with Xerathi cubs, living, breathing, absolutely terrified Xerathi cubs who had been refusing all sustenance for 6 days straight. Let me give you some context, because the sheer audacity of what I was witnessing requires proper background. The Xerathi are apex predators from the rimworlds, standing 8 feet tall when fully grown, covered in bone-white exoskeletons that can deflect plasma fire, and equipped with mandibles capable of crushing titanium alloy. They communicate through pheromone releases and subsonic frequencies that most species can't even detect. Their cultural concept of trust extends exactly as far as their immediate family unit, and their idea of diplomacy involves establishing dominance through controlled acts of violence. In other words, they are the absolute last species in the galaxy you would expect to bond with a 5'4" human who smells like synthetic lavender and has the survival instincts of decorative moss. The cubs had arrived at our research station as part of a desperate last-resort diplomatic initiative. Their homeworld was dying, consumed by a plague that specifically targeted their food chain. The Xerathi High Command, in a move that shocked every xenobiologist in known space, had agreed to send their 3 most promising juveniles to our facility for potential relocation and species preservation. 3 cubs. The future of an entire civilization. No pressure there. They were named according to Xerathi tradition: Huntclaw, Swiftstrike, and Shadowbane. Each name represented the specific skills they would develop as adults, assuming they lived long enough to develop anything beyond trauma and malnutrition. The cubs had been in our care for exactly 1 week, and in that time, they had refused every type of sustenance we offered. Xerathi dietary requirements, prepared according to exact specifications provided by their government. Synthetic proteins designed to match their homeworld's ecosystem. Live prey animals from compatible biospheres. Even emergency nutrition supplements that should have triggered automatic feeding responses. Nothing worked. They just sat in their habitat, 3 small figures, huddled together in the center of a space designed to accommodate adult Xerathi, slowly wasting away while our entire research team racked their brains for solutions. Dr. Velik Stormwind, our head xenobiologist, was pulling his tentacles out in frustration. "It doesn't make sense," he kept repeating. "Their biochemistry should respond to these nutrients. The molecular structure is identical to their natural food sources." Assistant Director Faye Goldenheart, meanwhile, was fielding increasingly hostile communications from the Xerathi High Command. "They're demanding updates every 6 hours, she reported during our daily crisis meetings. "If these cubs die in our care, it won't just be a diplomatic incident. It'll be grounds for war." And that's when Luna Brightwater volunteered for what everyone assumed would be a suicide mission. Luna was part of our human exchange program, one of those irritatingly optimistic individuals that Earth kept sending us as cultural ambassadors. She had been at the station for 2 months, cheerfully disrupting established protocols with her bizarre human tendency to treat every alien species like potential friends instead of research subjects. She had somehow convinced our glacial serpents to participate in what she called group therapy sessions. She had taught our methane breathers to play human card games. She had even gotten our notoriously antisocial void dwellers to attend social gatherings by introducing them to something called karaoke night. But the Xerathi cubs were different. They weren't just antisocial or culturally distant. They were apex predators in active psychological crisis, traumatized juveniles whose species had never, in recorded history, accepted aid from non-Xerathi entities. When Luna knocked on my office door and asked for permission to try something with the cubs, my first instinct was to have her sedated for her own safety. "Absolutely not," I told her, not looking up from my reports. "The cubs are in quarantine protocol. No direct contact with non-essential personnel." But they're dying, Luna said, settling into the chair across from my desk without invitation. Another charming human trait. Their complete disregard for hierarchical boundaries. They're refusing sustenance due to psychological trauma, I corrected. We're working on solutions. For 6 days, you've been working on solutions. How's that going? I finally looked up at her. Luna had brown hair that seemed to have its own gravitational field, green eyes that held entirely too much intelligence for someone who had once tried to adopt a parasitic space fungus, and the kind of expression that usually preceded significant property damage. The situation is complex, I said carefully. Xerathi psychology doesn't respond to conventional intervention methods. Have you tried asking them what they want? I blinked all 4 of my eyes in sequence. I'm sorry, what? Asking them. You know, communication. Have you actually tried talking to the cubs about why they won't eat? Ms. Brightwater, the Xerathi communicate through pheromone releases and subsonic frequencies. Even if we could replicate their communication methods, their psychological state makes meaningful dialogue unlikely. Luna tilted her head in that peculiar way humans did when they were about to say something that would give me a headache. What if the problem isn't how they're communicating, but how we're listening? 3 hours later, against my better judgment and direct orders from Assistant Director Goldenheart, I found myself escorting Luna to the Xerathi habitat observation deck. The cubs were exactly where they had been for the past 6 days. Huddled together in the center of their enclosure, 3 small forms barely moving except for the shallow rise and fall of their breathing. Their bone-white exoskeletons had lost their natural luster, dulled by stress and malnutrition. Their normally alert postures had collapsed into defensive crouches. They looked, for lack of a better term, heartbroken. "Oh," Luna whispered, pressing her hand against the observation window. "Oh, you poor babies." The cubs' heads lifted slightly at the sound of her voice, which should have been impossible since the observation deck was soundproofed and positioned above their visual range. "How did they know I was here?" Luna asked. I checked the habitat sensors, frowning at the readings. Unclear. Xerathi sensory capabilities are highly developed, but they shouldn't be able to detect your presence through our barriers. Luna was quiet for a moment, studying the cubs with an intensity that made me nervous. When humans got that look, they were usually about to do something that would require significant paperwork. "Kelvin," she said finally, "I need to go in there." "Absolutely not. Xerathi cubs are still apex predators. Their defensive reflexes could kill you before you realized you were in danger. They're not going to hurt me." "How could you possibly know that?" Luna turned to look at me, and her expression held something I had never seen before in a human: absolute certainty. "Because they're not angry. They're grieving." Before I could stop her, she was moving toward the habitat entry controls. I lunged after her, but humans, for all their apparent fragility, could be surprisingly quick when motivated. "Luna, stop! You don't understand what you're dealing with." She paused at the airlock controls, her hand hovering over the entry sequence. "I understand that 3 children are dying because no one has bothered to ask them what they need." "They're not children. They're kids," Luna interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of steel that I was beginning to recognize as a fundamental human trait. Scared, traumatized kids who have lost everything they've ever known. And right now, they're giving up because they think no one cares about them. She activated the airlock before I could override her. Commands. The entry sequence took 30 seconds. 30 seconds during which I frantically contacted security, activated emergency protocols, and prepared to witness the first human fatality at our research station. Luna stepped into the habitat like she was entering a friend's living room instead of the territory of 3 apex predators. She moved slowly, her hands visible, making soft sounds that definitely weren't in any Xerathi communication database. The cubs' reaction was immediate and terrifying. All 3 rose to their feet, their mandibles spreading in threat displays, their exoskeletons shifting to darker stress colors. Huntclaw, the largest, positioned himself between Luna and his siblings. Any sane person would have retreated immediately. Any trained xenobiologist would have activated emergency extraction. Any reasonable individual would have shown proper fear in the face of creatures that could dismember her without effort. Luna sat down on the floor, Not at a safe distance, not behind any barrier. She sat down right there in the open, cross-legged, looking up at three predators who were actively displaying threat behaviors. And she smiled. "Hi there," she said, her voice warm and gentle. "I'm Luna. I know you probably can't understand me, but I wanted to meet you." The cubs froze. Their threat displays faltered, confusion replacing aggression in their postures. Luna reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made my blood pressure spike. A sealed food container. "I brought lunch," she continued, opening the container to reveal what appeared to be a human meal. "I figured maybe you guys were hungry too." She began eating, right there on the floor of the habitat, completely ignoring the three apex predators who were staring at her like she had lost her mind. Which, from any rational perspective, she probably had. Huntclaw took a cautious step forward, his head tilting as he watched this bizarre alien creature consuming food in his territory. His siblings flanked him, their earlier aggression replaced by intense curiosity. Luna took another bite, chewed thoughtfully, then looked up at the cubs. "You know," she said conversationally, "where I come from, we have this thing called sharing. When someone's hungry, you share your food with them. It's not about the food itself, really. It's about showing you care." She broke off a piece of what looked like bread and held it out toward Huntclaw. "I know this probably isn't what you usually eat," she said, "but maybe you'd like to try it? Sometimes when you're really sad, eating something different can help you feel a little better." Huntclaw stared at the offered food for a long moment. His mandibles clicked in what I would later learn was a Xerathi expression of confusion mixed with cautious interest. Then, moving with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb, he reached out with one clawed appendage and gently took the bread from Luna's hand. He examined it, sniffed it, and then, in what would become the most documented moment in xenobiological history, he ate it. His siblings watched in fascination as their brother consumed alien food offered by an alien creature in an act of unprecedented trust. And that's when Luna did something that changed everything. She broke off two more pieces and offered them to Swift Strike and Shadowbane. Within minutes, all three cubs were sitting around this impossible human, sharing her meal and making soft sounds that definitely weren't in their species' documented vocal range. They were purring. Xerathi cubs, apex predators whose species had never shown affection to outsiders, were purring at a human who had offered them bread. I stood there in the observation deck, watching through security feeds as Luna Brightwater accomplished the impossible through the simple act of treating alien children like, well, children. And that's when I realized we had been approaching this entire situation completely wrong. The cubs weren't refusing food because of biochemical incompatibility or psychological trauma. They were refusing food because no one had bothered to invite them to the table. The implications of what I had just witnessed hit me like a meteor strike to the cranium. Luna had solved our crisis not through advanced xenobiology or sophisticated psychological intervention, but through basic social courtesy. She had treated the cubs like guests instead of specimens. Within moments of finishing her shared meal, something even more extraordinary happened. Huntclaw stood up, moved to the feeding station we had been desperately trying to get them to use for days, and began eating the Xerathi nutrition supplements like they were the most delicious thing in the galaxy. His siblings followed immediately, practically racing each other to the food dispensers. "Well," I muttered to myself, watching three starving apex predators finally accept sustenance because a human had shown them basic table manners. "That's going to require some interesting paperwork." Dr. Stormwind burst into the observation deck, his tentacles flailing in what I recognized as extreme agitation. "Kelvin, the habitat sensors are showing massive biochemical changes. The cubs' stress hormones have dropped to normal levels, their digestive systems are fully active, and their social bonding indicators are off the charts. What did you do?" I gestured toward the habitat, where Luna was now sitting beside the feeding station, chatting with three cubs who were eating with the enthusiasm of teenagers discovering pizza. "I let a human be human." "That's not scientifically possible," Stormwind protested. "Xerathi juveniles don't form cross-species social bonds. Their neural pathways aren't developed for non-familial attachments. Tell them that, I said dryly, as Swift Strike brought Luna a piece of his own food to try. She accepted it with the same grace she had shown when sharing her meal, taking a small bite and nodding, appreciatively, despite the fact that Xerathi nutrition probably tasted like processed cardboard. The cubs made those purring sounds again, a vocalization that was rapidly becoming my new favorite xenobiological mystery. Assistant Director Goldenheart arrived 15 minutes later, took one look at the scene, and immediately began having what humans would call a nervous breakdown. "This is completely outside protocol," she announced, her voice climbing toward frequencies that made the air recycling systems whine. "We have no baseline for human-Xerathi interaction, no safety parameters, no psychological profiles, no emergency procedures. We also have 3 healthy cubs who are finally eating," I pointed out. "That's not the point. We can't just let untrained personnel make contact with critical specimens based on hunches and good intentions." Luna's voice crackled through the habitat communicator. "Did someone just call these kids specimens?" "Oh, right." Human hearing was remarkably acute when they chose to pay attention. Goldenheart's complexion shifted to an alarming shade of purple. "Ms. Brightwater, please report for immediate extraction. You're in violation of multiple safety protocols." "I'm having lunch with friends," Luna replied cheerfully. "Huntclaw was just telling me about their homeworld. Did you know Xerathi cubs traditionally eat communally? It's a social bonding mechanism that reinforces family structures." I felt my worldview reorganizing itself in real time. "They were telling you about their culture?" "Well, not in words exactly, but body language is pretty universal. Watch this." Luna turned to Huntclaw and made a gesture I didn't recognize, pointing to herself and then to the cubs while making a questioning expression. Huntclaw's response was immediate. He moved closer to Luna, gently touched her shoulder with one clawed appendage, and made a series of clicks and purrs that sounded remarkably like conversation. "He just said they want me to stay," Luna translated. "At least I think that's what he said." The shoulder touch means acceptance in most predator cultures, and the vocal pattern suggests request or invitation. Dr. Stormwind's tentacles had gone completely still, which in his species indicated either deep thought or complete system shutdown. "How do you know about cross-species behavioral patterns?" "I read," Luna said simply. "Your library has fascinating research on interspecies communication theory. Turns out most sentient species have similar basic social needs, even if they express them differently." Shadowbane, the smallest and quietest of the cubs, approached Luna with something in his claws. He offered it to her with the same careful precision his brother had shown earlier. It was a small piece of his own exoskeleton, naturally shed during growth. In Xerathi culture, I suddenly realized, this was probably equivalent to a friendship bracelet. Luna accepted the gift with appropriate solemnity, examining it carefully before placing it in her pocket. "Thank you, Shadowbane. It's beautiful." The cub's purring intensified, and he settled down beside her with the contentment of someone who had just been understood. That's when the real crisis began. The communication came through our deep space array exactly 4 hours after Luna's breakthrough with the cubs. The Xerathi High Command wasn't just sending an update request. They were sending a battle fleet. 18 war vessels, Captain Rex Ironheart reported, his scarred face grim as he delivered the tactical briefing. ETA 72 hours. They're demanding immediate status updates on their cubs and threatening military intervention if satisfactory progress isn't demonstrated. Assistant Director Goldenheart looked like she was about to molt from stress. What are we supposed to tell them? That we solved their diplomatic crisis through the power of shared sandwiches? "Actually," I said, studying the data feeds from the habitat, "that might be exactly what we tell them." Everyone turned to stare at me. "Think about it," I continued. "The cubs were refusing food not because of trauma or biochemical incompatibility, but because they were observing traditional social protocols. In Xerathi culture, eating is a communal activity that reinforces social bonds. They wouldn't eat alone because, from their perspective, eating without proper social context is a sign of abandonment or exile. Dr. Stormwind's tentacles began moving in what I recognized as his equivalent of excited gesturing. That would explain their stress responses. They weren't just hungry, they were socially isolated according to their own cultural understanding. And Luna fixed that by treating them like family members instead of research subjects, I concluded. She invited them to share a meal, which in their cultural framework meant accepting them into her social group. Captain Ironheart frowned. That's all very interesting from an academic perspective, but how does it help us with an incoming battle fleet? That's when Luna's voice came through the communicator again, carrying the kind of cheerful confidence that usually preceded major diplomatic breakthroughs or catastrophic disasters. Hey, Kelvin. The cubs want to talk to their parents. The silence that followed could have been measured in geological ages. I'm sorry, Goldenheart said slowly. Did you say the cubs want to communicate with the Xerathi High Command? Not the High Command exactly. Their actual parents. Huntclaw says they have something important to tell them about humans. Within 30 minutes, we had established a direct communication link between our habitat and the approaching Xerathi fleet. The technical challenges alone should have taken days to resolve. But apparently, when 3 apex predator cubs specifically request to speak with their parents, bureaucratic obstacles tend to disappear rapidly. The first face to appear on our communication screen belonged to General Razorclaw, Huntclaw's father and supreme military commander of the Xerathi expedition. 8 feet of bone-white exoskeleton, mandibles that could crush starship hull plating, and eyes that held the kind of controlled violence that made veteran soldiers nervous. His first words were delivered in the subsonic frequencies that served as formal Xerathi communication. A series of growls and clicks that our translators rendered as, "Report status of offspring immediately." Huntclaw's response was unexpected. Instead of the formal military acknowledgement his father was clearly expecting, the cub approached the communication terminal and began purring. Not the aggressive vocalizations of a properly trained Xerathi warrior, but the soft, content sounds I'd been hearing all day. General Razorclaw's reaction was immediate and intense. His mandibles spread in what I was beginning to recognize as complete confusion, and his next transmission carried undertones of what could only be described as parental concern. Offspring exhibits non-standard vocal patterns. Request medical evaluation. That's when Luna stepped into view of the communication terminal, still wearing Shadowbane's exoskeleton gift like a badge of honor. "General Razorclaw," she said, offering what appeared to be a human approximation of a Xerathi greeting gesture. "Your sons are healthy and happy. They wanted to tell you about something they've learned." The silence from the other end of the communication link was so complete I could hear the station's atmospheric recyclers humming. Then General Razorclaw spoke, and his voice carried something I had never heard from a Xerathi before. Uncertainty. "You are human." "I am," Luna confirmed. "And your cubs are remarkable individuals. They've taught me more about interspecies cooperation in one day than I learned in months of formal study." Swift Strike moved into view, positioning himself beside Luna with the casual familiarity of someone introducing a friend to family. He began vocalizing in patterns that were definitely not standard Xerathi military communication. Our translators struggled with the unusual syntax, finally producing, "Father." Human Luna shows proper feeding protocols. Human Luna demonstrates family inclusion behaviors. Human Luna creates social safety for offspring. Request continued association with Human Luna. The implications of that statement hit the communication deck like a plasma torpedo. Swift Strike hadn't just reported that he liked Luna. He had formally requested that she be accepted into their family structure. General Razorclaw's response took several long moments. When it came, his voice carried the weight of someone whose entire worldview was being forcibly reorganized. "Offspring? Requests adoption of alien entity?" "Not adoption exactly," Luna said, somehow managing to navigate interstellar diplomacy with the same casual confidence she used for everything else. "More like friendship. Your sons are incredible, and I'd be honored to continue learning from them." Shadowbane chose that moment to present Luna with another gift. A small piece of food from his own meal, offered with the careful ceremony of a formal cultural exchange. Luna accepted it with appropriate gravitas, took a small bite, and nodded her approval. The cubs' purring intensified to levels that made the habitat's acoustic dampeners strain. That's when General Razorclaw said something that changed the entire diplomatic landscape. Human demonstrates proper offspring care protocols. Xerathi High Command requests expanded cultural exchange. 3 hours later, instead of a military intervention, we had the foundation for the first Xerathi human friendship treaty in recorded history. The cubs continued their recovery under Luna's informal supervision, learning human customs while teaching her Xerathi traditions. Dr. Stormwind started documenting interspecies social bonding mechanisms that would revolutionize xenobiological research. Assistant Director Goldenheart began planning the most ambitious cultural exchange program in galactic history. And me? I learned that sometimes the most complex problems have the simplest solutions. All it took was one human who understood that the universal language isn't mathematics or music or even violence. It's kindness. Specifically, the kind of kindness that says, "You look hungry. Would you like to share my lunch?" The cubs returned to their homeworld 6 months later, but not before establishing formal cultural exchange protocols that would bring Xerathi and human youngsters together for generations. Luna received a commendation from both governments and an offer to head the new Interspecies Youth Development Program. As for the cubs themselves, they kept the human tradition of shared meals, introducing the concept of communal dining to Xerathi society. Within a year, their entire culture had adopted what they called Luna protocols for integrating new members into family units. Sometimes evolution happens through natural selection. Sometimes it happens through genetic drift. And sometimes, apparently, it happens because someone offers to share their sandwich with 3 scared kids who just needed to know that someone cared enough to invite them to dinner. Who knew that the future of interstellar diplomacy would be built on proper table manners and the radical concept of treating children like people? Luna did, apparently. But then again, humans have always been suspiciously good at that sort of thing. But the story doesn't end there, because the universe has a twisted sense of humor. And just when you think you've witnessed the pinnacle of impossible events, reality decides to raise the stakes. 2 weeks after the initial breakthrough, we received an emergency transmission from the Outer Rim territories. 3 more species had contacted the Galactic Council, requesting similar Luna protocols for their own troubled juveniles. The first was from the Christek Collective, whose silicon-based youngsters had been exhibiting what their scientists called terminal social withdrawal syndrome. These adolescent beings, normally highly communal, had suddenly begun isolating themselves in individual crystal formations, refusing all contact with their hive mind network. The second came from the Vapor Lords of Nimbus Station, whose gaseous offspring were experiencing unprecedented density fluctuations that threatened their physical cohesion. Their traditional atmospheric regulation techniques had proven completely ineffective. The third, and most disturbing, arrived from the peaceful harmony builders of the inner systems. Their empathically gifted children had begun what could only be described as emotional hibernation, cutting themselves off from all telepathic contact and displaying signs of severe psychological distress. "Let me get this straight," I said to Luna during our emergency briefing. 3 completely different species, with entirely different biological systems and social structures, are all experiencing similar juvenile behavioral crises? Luna was sitting cross-legged on the floor of the conference room, because chairs were apparently too conventional for someone who had revolutionized interstellar relations through sandwich sharing. The 3 Xerathi cubs were arranged around her like bodyguards, having refused to be separated from their adopted human sister since the initial breakthrough. "It makes sense when you think about it," Luna said, absently stroking Shadowbane's exoskeleton while the cub purred contentedly. "All of these species are dealing with rapid social changes. The Christek Collective just integrated with galactic communication networks. The Vapor Lords recently established trade relationships with solid matter species. The Harmony Builders are adapting to non-telepathic contact protocols. Dr. Stormwind's tentacles were performing what I had learned to recognize as his excited hypothesis formation dance. You're suggesting that juvenile psychological distress is a universal response to cultural transition? I'm suggesting that kids need stability during times of change, Luna replied. And when their entire society is adapting to new ways of being, the children often feel lost or forgotten. They need someone to help them understand that change doesn't mean abandonment. Huntclaw lifted his head and made a series of clicks that our translators rendered as, "Human Luna speaks truth patterns. Young ones require social anchoring during transition times." The fact that our translators were now producing poetic philosophical statements from Xerathi cubs was still giving me headaches, but I had learned to roll with it. "So, what do you propose?" Assistant Director Goldenheart asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer and wasn't entirely pleased about it. Luna's smile could have powered a small space station. Road trip. 3 days later, I found myself aboard a diplomatic transport vessel, watching Luna pack what appeared to be half of our station's food replicator inventory into portable containers. "Snacks," she explained when I questioned the logistics. "Universal peacemaking tool. Every species I've studied has some form of communal eating ritual. Find the right food, present it properly, and you can bridge almost any cultural gap." The Xerathi cubs had insisted on accompanying Luna on her interspecies intervention tour, despite protests from their parents about proper military protocol. General Razorclaw had eventually conceded after Huntclaw formally declared the mission a strategic cultural reconnaissance operation, with Luna serving as their integration specialist. Our first stop was the Christek Collective's homeworld, a planet that looked like someone had broken a rainbow and scattered the pieces across a landscape of living geological formations. The isolated juveniles were housed in individual crystal spires, each one pulsing with dim, mournful light patterns. According to our briefings, they had been in self-imposed isolation for 3 months, refusing all attempts at hive mind reconnection. Luna took one look at the situation and immediately requested access to the collective's central communication hub. "What are you planning?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect that asking Luna to explain her methods was like asking quantum physics to be more intuitive. "Group dinner," she said simply. "These kids aren't withdrawing because they're antisocial. They're overwhelmed by too much connection. They need to learn that community can exist without losing individual identity." What followed was perhaps the most surreal dining experience of my career. Luna somehow convinced the Christek elders to allow her to establish a neutral zone in their central plaza, where the isolated juveniles could observe without being forced into hive mind connection. She then proceeded to have a picnic. Right there in the middle of an alien city, surrounded by living crystal formations, she spread out a blanket and began unpacking food containers. The Xerathi cubs joined her immediately, demonstrating the communal eating behaviors they had learned from human protocols. They made a point of offering food to each other, sharing portions and maintaining individual conversation, while participating in group activities. The Christek juveniles watched from their spires, their light patterns shifting from mournful isolation to curious observation. Luna began describing human family dinner traditions, explaining how humans managed to maintain individual personalities while still feeling connected to their family groups. She talked about how sharing food was a way of saying, "You matter to me," without requiring complete mental fusion. Slowly, carefully, the first Christek juvenile emerged from his spire. Then another. Within an hour, Luna had facilitated the first successful voluntary community gathering in months, simply by demonstrating that connection didn't require the loss of self. Our second stop, the Vapor Lord's atmospheric cities, presented entirely different challenges. How do you have a communal meal with beings made of sentient gas? Luna's solution was typically unconventional. She researched traditional Vapor Lord cultural practices and learned that they had ancient rituals involving the sharing of essence gifts, specific atmospheric compounds that carried emotional significance. She convinced our ship's atmospheric processors to create harmless aromatic compounds that mimicked human comfort foods, then invited the troubled juveniles to a scent-sharing ceremony. The idea was to create a cross-species sensory experience that approximated communal dining. The young Vapor Lords, who had been struggling with density regulation due to emotional distress, found stability through the shared sensory experience. Luna's human approach to emotional processing, acknowledging feelings without being overwhelmed by them, provided a framework that helped them manage their gaseous forms more effectively. By the time we reached the Harmony Builders' telepathic communes, word of Luna's successes had spread throughout the diplomatic networks. We arrived to find delegations from 17 different species requesting consultations for their own juvenile integration challenges. Luna handled it all with the same casual competence she brought to every impossible situation. She established what she called neutral emotional zones for the overwhelmed empathic children, taught them human techniques for emotional boundary setting, and created structured interaction protocols that allowed telepathic connection without emotional overload. 6 months later, the Brightwater protocols had become standard practice for juvenile integration across 43 different species. Luna had been appointed as the Galactic Council's first director of interspecies youth development, with the Xerathi cubs serving as her official cultural liaisons. The universe, it seemed, had been waiting for someone to figure out that most problems could be solved by treating people like people, regardless of what kind of people they happened to be.